All right. Um, Hello everyone. Can you guys hear me? Okay, sounds good. I think we'll just get started right away, and whoever joins later can just kind of go on about and join in the middle. So yeah, welcome to my seminar. I'm one of the consultants at Accepted Together, and today we're just going to be going over the basic structure of MMI and the general tips, as well as the specific tips I have for the MMI that is for the upcoming interview season. So important reminders is that this seminar is recorded. I'll also be presenting a little bit more like general advice just because of time constraint. For those who are interested in more individualized sessions that are tailored towards them, I will also be providing package information at the end. And please reach out to me on acceptedtogether.com for any follow-up questions that you may have about the seminar. So a little bit about myself. I graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Physiology in Western University, so that's in Ontario. Just a little bit of some things that I spend most of my time on is that I worked as a bubble tea barista at the Alley for about 4 years, and I was also a varsity fencer at University of Western Ontario. I'm also very passionate about just healthy lifestyle. So things like just working out, going on little jogs, being able to take care of mental health, as well as mentorship, just like, making sure to provide guidance, especially to immigrants who may not have as much of a guidance in terms of like, how do I get into medical school, or how do I do well in school? Just things like that. For fun, I like to play board games, puzzles, or just video games in general. And I've also been involved in a lot of advocacy work. So for example, one of the examples that I have is I've been the president of Han Voice, which is an advocacy group that basically vocalizes human rights for North Korean refugees who live in Canada. So just to give a very brief overview about the MMI, it stands for multiple mini interviews. A majority of the Canadian medical schools use this system, as well as many other US medical schools. There's about 10 stations total, including rest stations. So you'll have about 1 or 2 rest stations where you'll just get to chat with another medical student or someone who is just there to kind of facilitate. Each station will last about 10 to 12 minutes. So that includes about 2 or 3 minutes to read the scenario, about 8 minutes to answer the question, as well as to answer follow-up questions. So usually your actual response to the question will last about 5 minutes. And so you want to leave about 4 to 5 minutes or 3 to 4 minutes at the end in case the interviewer has any follow-up questions for you. Your interviewer, as I said before, can ask follow-up questions. The number of the follow-up questions can vary. They could just ask you like 1 or 2 or 3. But it's always good to have some time left over for follow-ups, because it helps the interviewer basically to kind of guide you the right way in terms of answering the question. And once you reach the time limit for each station, the station will end automatically. So I'm talking in terms of, like on Zoom. So on Zoom, like the breakout room will basically kind of just end automatically, and you'll be moved on to the next station. So another important note is that each station is independent of each other, which means that no interviewer will see more than one station that you've done. So one of the advantages of MMI is that if you kind of screw up one station, you can still do well in the other stations, and you'll be able to, still do like very well overall in the MMI. And to just go over some of the types of MMI questions, here are some of the very like general examples that I could come up with. So the first one is definitely personal. So for example, it could ask you a question about, tell me about a time when you had to deal with a difficult situation, or tell me about a time when you had to confront someone So there's a lot of questions where you'll have to be very vulnerable about yourself, and you have to be very honest with kind of the situation that you were in. How did you feel, and how did you kind of overcome? It's usually about a scenario where you have to overcome something, or you have to face something uncomfortable. So really being honest there, and just being able to, just be vulnerable about your, whether it's your insecurities or your biggest fears. Those would be examples of personal MMI questions. The second category is the ethical scenarios. So one of the more, primary example that people know about is being a good friend versus maintaining academic integrity. So, for example, if you saw a friend who you're close with and he was like cheating on a very important exam, how do you deal with the situation? Like, how do you approach your friend while also being, sticking to your principles, right? Like, do you want to maintain the academic integrity of the institution? Because, cheating, it gives someone an unfair advantage over other people. So how do you address that problem without breaking the friendship with that person? Or if you want to, keep that relationship at all. So those are ethical scenarios. And then thirdly, compare and contrast. So as opposed to ethical scenarios, these are much more of like, you can almost choose like one side or the other, and it doesn't matter too much. So for example, a question could ask you the pros and cons of online education. We saw that from the COVID days, a lot of education has moved on to online learning. So, just talking about like from your own experience, basically, what were the pros and cons of like learning online in terms of attention span, in terms of convenience, and in the end, which one would you choose over another? So for this one, it kind of comes down to, how comprehensive can you be? Like, can you really hit all the important points for each of the pros and cons for both sides, and then eventually choose one side? That's the third example, and just more of those continued. Acting stations have been very traditional before COVID hit. So they were very prevalent in like in-person interviews during MMIs. When COVID did hit though, a lot of schools um, kind of decided to go on with acting stations or drop acting stations. More information on that will be given to you on the interview information session. So each year will be different and it'll be confidential. Um, and acting stations can be, it's usually one of the hardest stations that applicants face. And so if, if in an MMI, the committee drops your worst station, it tends to be your acting station because there's a lot of variability, and it tends to give you like the most anxiety and panic. So an example would be, breaking bad news, right? So maybe you're a physician who has to enter a room and tell the mother that their son, is not doing very well, and the prognosis isn't looking so good. Like, how do you deal with, things like emotional anxiety and like kind of people just like yelling at you? Like, how do you maintain your composure? As well as how do you, convey your message without breaking character or just being very considerate of the other party? Second last one is current issues. So these are kind of just asking for your opinion on things that are actually happening in the real world. So for example, some of the most important, aspects of healthcare in Canada, especially, is the lack of family physicians. So currently we actually have, especially in BC, for example, we have a very severe family physician shortage crisis. So there's been a lot of actions that's been taken care of. Some of the examples I could actually give right now is that BC actually recently passed a legislation where the payment model for family physicians in BC is actually much, much better now. So it's supposed to be like a financial incentive for more people to choose family physician as their specialty. Second of all, if you are applying in this cycle, you might have already gotten an email from Queen's University. They actually have about 20 seats available for students who are willing to kind of lock in their career choice as a family physician in Oshawa. So there's already, kind of measures being taken to make sure that more people are going to family medicine. And those things would be very beneficial to know and understand about, as well as healthcare for marginalized communities. So, one primary, very, very prevalent example is Indigenous communities, right? Like, how do we close the cultural gap or the trauma that Indigenous people have, and kind of build that trust relationship between the current healthcare system and the Indigenous community. That's one of the biggest issues in terms of like literally their geographical isolation as well as a cultural isolation. So that's something that is definitely it is considered very important for a lot of medical schools, as well as COVID-19, right? It's 2023, it's been 4 years since the start of COVID, and a lot of things have changed since then. And it applies not to just, how we're doing things in school, but also in healthcare as well, right? So how is COVID, affecting, our learning, our healthcare system? Like, how do you foresee, COVID-19 to change in the future? Those could be like possible things that you could think about. And these are honestly such a short list from so many different things that are going on in the world. And so just, keeping up with the news, listening to podcasts, whatever, could be very important, a very essential arsenal when it comes to the MMIs. Lastly, you have the abstract stations. So McMaster is known to do a lot of these, a lot of like collaboration, or there's a lot of art and literature. So maybe some of the things that were also known to be on the MMIs are, for example, like picture stations, or like cartoons, like what it makes you like, how does it make you feel, like what kind of lessons can you learn from this kind of art? So kind of like connecting art and literature and something that is more abstract into something that is more personal to you, something more concrete, or even connecting it to the field of medicine. So those were, I think, about 6 or 7 examples of the types of MMI questions that you could get. And my tip for the MMI in general is that you should practice, practice, and practice. There's nothing better than just like keep grinding out different types of practice questions. Like 7 different categories, and that's not even a comprehensive list of different types of questions, is a lot. And if you happen to get a completely new kind of question on the MMI, it can be very disorientating, right? So in order to like minimize the amount of panic or the anxiety that you will get on the interview day, you want to just like keep on practicing, get into that mood of, okay, like this is like the real deal, like I have to do my best, is one of the best things you can do for yourself to prepare yourself. It's also ideal to practice in a small group setting, as opposed to like just one partner or in a larger group setting, because if you only have one partner, chances are that they'll probably give you advice that is a little bit too limited in terms of perspective. Everyone has a different kind of upbringing and their cultural background and their opinion on things, and getting different, perspectives or opinions or feedback on your answers can be very beneficial in terms of like making your answer as diverse as possible. That being said, if you have too large of a group, then you're going to have too much feedback and you're basically not going to know which one to choose from. So I'd say stick to a smaller group and see where that can get you. And during practices, you'll notice that like there is a pattern, right? Like if you do like 3 questions of the same category, you'll start to realize that there is a framework that you can follow for each kind of question. So for example, like if it's like a compare and contrast station, you can start off with acknowledging that there's pros and cons of each side, and then you list the pros and cons of each side, and then you choose a side based on your, maybe like cost benefit analyses. So have a framework, because it's nice to have a framework, that way you don't have to like really worry about, how to organize your answers and spend more time on the quality of your answers instead. As well, I know it's on Zoom, so the amount of yourself that you'll be showing to interviewers is limited to, like your chest level up. But still try to have a lot of nonverbal communication, right? It's really important that your interviewers kind of engaged in this conversation, not really like, you want to make sure that they're not losing focus, right? And so one of the things that you could do is just practicing your hand motions, your body language, as well as just having a diverse set of emotions that you can show to interviewer. That way you can keep that connection between yourself and the interviewer, and in the end have a better lasting impression on your interview. And also, I would say that timing is also very crucial. Um, as I've mentioned before, you're going to have, I'm just going to use UBC as an example. You're going to have 8 minutes to answer the question, right? Now, let's say typically you're going to take about 5 minutes to answer the main question. Then you're going to have 3 minutes to answer any follow-up questions. What I would suggest is that if you get a follow-up question and you can answer within a minute or a minute and a half, then you should do that, because it leaves another 1 minute and a half for another follow-up question. Whereas if you took like 2 minutes and 30 seconds and the interviewer now only has 30 seconds to ask another follow-up question, that leaves you at a very awkward place where you're definitely going to get cut off in the middle of your answer. So when I say timing, it means like not even just your main answer, just scheduling yourself throughout the entire 8 minutes to make sure that you can answer any kind of follow-up questions that they might have. So that's it for the practice part. And I would say you should also be very confident at your interview in general. So I know it's like very anxiety inducing, and you kind of don't know where you place your hands and stuff like that. But just remember that you were chosen for a reason, right? They saw your application and they said, okay, I think this person's going to be a good fit for our medical school. We just want to, have a conversation with her and do this interview to make sure that, she's the right, or she or he is the right fit for this school. And so just know that you're already qualified based on what you've written in your application. Just own it and be yourself, and you'll be okay. And also remember to smile, right? It's always good to spread a positive energy during your interview. It'll also just like, unconsciously leave a positive impression about yourself. And lastly, do not afraid to have an opinion, right? There'll be a lot of stations where you could kind of choose the middle ground, right? Oh, I understand that this side has this pros and cons. I understand this other side has this kind of concerns. And in the end, I'm just gonna like see how it goes. So a lot of people tend to kind of leave it at that, kind of like stay in the middle and not choose a side at the end. But personally, I believe that when you choose a side and you have an opinion, and then you support your argument with, for example, like personal examples, that makes a much stronger answer than someone who might opt out and just like kind of stick to the middle. Obviously, when you do choose a side, like you want to make sure to acknowledge, the other side that you are arguing against, to make sure that you don't seem, inconsiderate of any kind. But definitely, if a question asks you to pick a side, definitely pick a side and be confident in your answer. Don't like second guess yourself once you've chosen a side. And lastly, it's always good to have personal examples ready. So how I went about it in last year, and it worked really well for me, is that there are these roles called CanMed roles. So for example, like advocacy, scholar, professional, communicator. So those are the main pillars of, being what a good physician should be, right? And it's basically the same qualities that your interviewers will look for during your interview. So what I would do is, for each role, I would probably come up with 1 or 2 personal examples to make sure that I'm always ready to talk about it in my interview. So for example, let's say I have an example for communication, right? I could probably think about a time when I worked as a bubble tea barista at the alley, and talk about how, between employees, there's so much communication which is important to make sure that the store is running smoothly. So communication between employees, making sure what the customer ordered is correct, and just making sure that the workload is very smooth, as well as the communication that you might have with your customers, right? You want to make sure that some people might have, students like us have a very good understanding what the bubble tea might be, but oftentimes we had to deal with customers that are older, or younger, or just not very experienced with like this whole idea of bubble tea. And so being there to like explain ideas and simple concepts so they can truly understand and build that trust relationship is important. So there we go, right? Like I use, a trivial example of a bubble tea, but in the end, like that skill is very, like the interviewer can see that the skill is very transferable in a medical school setting or a physician setting. So that's kind of the idea that you want to go for. You want to give examples where you can draw parallels between your experiences and your role as a physician, rather than trying to draw like direct connections between your experiences and the CanMed roles. Or sorry, your direct relationship between your own experiences and how it might apply to medical school. Like you want to show it instead of just like telling it, if that makes sense. So that was the tips for the MMI in general. And I also have tips for the MMI based on kind of the question type that you might get. So for personal examples, I think one of the really big things that people tend to forget about is that you don't need to have like big experiences to impress your interviewers. So what I mean by that is, like, if a question is asking you on like how your experience in like the scholar role, you don't have to talk about, or like you might not have that in like experience in going on international conferences or presenting your poster at Harvard University. Like those are not really the things that they're looking for. It's more so about, like anything that you did where you had to go through some self-growth and, some independent research to kind of enlighten yourself in terms of knowledge and just like, like expanding your perspective of the world. That's something that they look for, right? So don't focus on, like how important the experience was in other people's perspectives. Just in your perspective, anything that you found to be important or significant in your self-growth, just talk about it, right? As long as you're confident about your answer and you really believe that, a particular experience has shaped you as who you are today, then don't be afraid to talk about it. And so this really brings back to like the title of my seminar, right? um like everyone has like just about average experiences. All of us will have had some kind of experience of academic background or being part of an executive of a club or being an athlete or doing some kind of research. And even though all of us did that, like how you tell your story to your interviewers can be very different because every person goes through a different experience, right? So just kind of backtrack into your own memories. Think about, what was that like epiphany for you, and make sure like you're able to like communicate it well into words. And that way, it'll be very easy for them to like follow on like how it actually made you grow stronger. Second of all, be humble. And also do not be afraid to put blame on yourself. So these two examples kind of go together in a sense that, when you're being humble, you're talking about like like, your insecurities as well as your vulnerabilities, right? Um, like you want to make sure that, for example, if they ask you a question about, oh, like how, like talk about a time when you weren't being a good communicator, then don't be afraid to literally talk about, you could talk about a time when you yelled at your roommate. Just make sure that after saying that, you come to some kind of a resolution. Say something like, I realized that I was not being, considerate of my roommate, or I was being overwhelmed with my own emotions and I was being immature. And so I decided to talk to him about it and kind of like resolve things from there, right? So acknowledge, the type of person that you were, your incapabilities of back then, who you were, into some kind of self-growth, right? Like, oh, I addressed the problem by talking to the person about it. So that kind of character change can really show a lot to the interviewer, because it shows them that you're humble, like you're able to accept humility, as well as you went through some kind of self-growth through those personal experiences. And again, show emotions. For ethical scenarios and compare and contrast scenarios, like I said earlier, definitely choose a side and advocate for it if you can, because like when you're advocating for something, like one of the candidate roles is literally being an advocate. Um, just make sure that when you are choosing a side and advocating for it, you have enough personal experiences or explanations that is concrete and something that you can like actually put forward, as opposed to you saying that, oh, I think it's important, right? Um, as opposed to I think it's important and leaving it there, you could say, I think it's important because in the past I had to deal with these kind of problems and I learned this. That's why I value this thing so much. So that would be kind of like part of your value statement. And so just having personal experiences tied to your argument can make arguments so much stronger. And think about like impact on stakeholders. This can be very useful in like ethical scenarios, right? So if your friend is cheating on a test, who's being impacted? Like, first of all, like your profs are being like indirectly impacted because they spent a lot of time designing these tests. So even though like no direct harm is being caused to them, it's still kind of nullifying the amount of work that they put into this. Also, like direct, just like direct harm that you're doing to other students who put in the same amount of work and they might get curved down or whatever because of the shortcuts that they're taking. In terms of compare and contrast, always acknowledge the other party. So this includes like a statement saying that, oh, while I understand that the other party is this and this and that, I still stick to this side of argument because of these reasons. So making sure that you're not only explaining your side of the argument, but also acknowledging the other side. And again, having personal examples to back up your argument. And for acting stations, like unless it's stated otherwise, unless like it tells you, oh, you're like a physician at this thing, try to be yourself, right? Like imagine yourself like actually being in the situation that's given to you. Like how would you act in that situation, whether you're a good friend or you're talking to a family member or you're talking to the patient. Think about what you would actually do in real life, and that will help you a lot, because if you got this far, you surely have good intentions, you want to do good for other people. Just remember those like basic principles and most of the things will be fine. And also be a good listener. So this might sound like counterintuitive, because you're in an interview where you're supposed to show a lot of yourself, but a lot of times you'll notice that it'd be impossible in an acting station for you to keep talking for 8 minutes. And in fact, I would say that would be a bad thing if you ever did that. You want to keep a conversation going, right? Like a two-way conversation where you listen to what they've got to say, and you kind of tailor your advice based on what they just told you, instead of you kind of assuming things and moving forward. So that's another like quality that they look for as interviewers. Like you should be a good listener, and be able to kind of like calm down, let them know that you're actually listening to them, um, and that's very important. And like last one is like not very pertinent to a lot of scenarios, but for some of them, you don't want to overstep boundaries. So for example, like if if there's an acting station where someone's just lost their dog, like you don't want to say things like, oh, everything's gonna be fine, or oh, I've been there before, if you've never been there before. Like don't make things up on the spot just to make them feel better, because a lot of times, like in real life and in acting scenarios, they kind of know that you're kind of like just making things up just to make things sound better at the moment. So really just back to my first point, try to be yourself. Think about what you would actually do in real life. And for the current issue MMI questions, like I said, stay up to date. Staying up to date is one of the best ways to tackle current issue questions. So listen to a lot of podcasts or news, because real life examples can help you how you might tackle a scenario, right? Like if an MMI question asked you, oh, how can we improve like indigenous healthcare systems? Like there's, so many examples, of the Canadian government taking actions to try and improve indigenous healthcare. So if you could just kind of draw examples from that, that could be a very helpful, like support for your arguments. And be aware of systemic discrimination and disparities in healthcare. Obviously, there's a lot of marginalized communities, including Indigenous people and Black communities, who are underserved. And it's very evident from, just like medical schools, as well as medical schools taking action to make sure that there's representation of those marginalized communities in healthcare. So just know that the types of discrimination that they go through, is it geographical? Is it healthcare? Is it like the cultural discrimination? So just know and understand and be able to describe some of these things will be very useful for the MMI. And lastly, for abstract stations, a lot of times because it deals with like art and like literature, and it allows you to be very imaginative with your answer. It's also easy for you to get lost in your answer. Like you explain one thing and then you're like, oh, like it could also mean this and this and that. And sometimes that's a good thing, but if you do too much of that, your interviewer will definitely get lost and they'll kind of be like, okay, so like what is like your central idea of your answer, right? And so just in terms of like organization, just make sure when you're answering these kind of questions, have a central theme that you want to go about. And, just think about like, maybe a central theme is like collaboration. And then you'll say like, oh, this picture reminds me of collaboration because of this aspect and this aspect and this aspect. So it's almost like having a thesis statement and, using parts of the picture as evidence to support your argument. So again, it comes down to organization. But then again, like you don't always want to give the most generic answer because there'll be a lot of other people interviewing at the same time as you. You want to make sure that you stand out a little bit, or you're able to kind of, answer in a way that is personal to you. So that's what I mean by being creative. Don't go over the line, but definitely like tailor it to yourself. Make it your own answer, right? So those are my advice in general, as well as for specific stations for the MMI. We'll run through a sample MMI scenario real quick, and then after that, I can take any questions that people may have. So the sample MMI scenario is you play on a hockey team. You have a teammate who is also the top scorer of the team, who was seen at the parties doing all sorts of drugs. Your coach decides to drug test you all, and on the day of, you see this player switch their samples with another player's. What do you do in this situation? So my advice or my approach to this problem in general would be summarize the question. Obviously, don't go too much on this. Maybe spend around like 15 to 30 seconds, because in the end, like it's not really part of your answer and you really want to fill in that 8 minutes with what you've got to say. And secondly, go over each side of the dilemma. So this will be an example of, an ethical dilemma question, right? So first you talk about the integrity of the sport and the other teammates' athlete career. In the case where the other teammates gets busted, and while he didn't even do any drugs, now maybe he wouldn't be able to compete anymore, right? And on the other side, you talk about how the teammate who is doing the drug swapping is also the top scorer of the team. So while it's like not part of the ethical side, you still want to talk about like your personal interests as well. Maybe you're interested in your hockey team winning the championship, so now you're kind of weighing the cost and benefits of taking which side. Now, do you want to pick a side? I think the answer is pretty clear. Like, sure, you want your hockey team to win a championship, but not while they're on drugs. So you pick a side, which in this case is to confront the person who is doing the drug swapping. And then you say, I'll have a conversation. And then I think this is probably one of the most important part of your answer is explaining why you picked that side, right? So again, this comes down to the acknowledgement that I was talking about earlier. So you say things like, oh, I understand that he might have done this because of personal reasons or because he really wants to win the championship, things like that, right? But after acknowledgement, you still stick with your principles and then you talk about what's important to you. Oh, what's important to me though is the integrity of the sport, as well as I care about the well-being of, my other teammates as well. And then you'll go through more of the specifics of what you would do, right? So for example, you might have a conversation with him, but in real life, he probably won't listen to you, or there's a good chance that he might not listen to you and not do anything about it. So then you talk about the course of action of what you would do if, your first plan didn't work. So maybe just having a talk with a coach or having with a higher administration if your talk with the first teammate didn't work that much. So just having like a whole timeline of what you would do, it can guide the interviewer very easily of what you're trying to do based on your principles. And then lastly, after you've kind of done through the run through of the scenario, you can now give a personal example that ties to this, maybe a similar scenario where you had to go through a personal dilemma. And lastly, you would give, a summary of your own answer. And this really keeps the interviewer kind of up to date and keep their focus until the last moment. Now, let's say you answer the question and the follow-up question was, what if this player begs you not to report him because he has scholarships on the line? So a lot of ethical scenarios will give you these follow-up questions where, it gives you a what if, right? And in my opinion, if in this kind of scenario, I would probably say that your answer would probably not change in terms of like reporting him, or at least like putting himself in the right place and get his samples properly tested. And the reason why you would always kind of stick to your initial answer is because these types of follow-up questions are meant to kind of test your principles, right? Like how willing are you to stick to your own principles? And if you are, obviously, like you have to come up with alternatives, right? Like if this person has scholarships on the line and you realize he's also like financially very dependent on the scholarship, then you can start, offering him support in terms of like if he's actually addicted to drugs, you can offer him focus groups for like drug addiction, or if he's going through like academic problems, you can offer to help him in school, right? And so you talk about the other ways you can help him out, but in the end, your principle doesn't change, right? And that's the main part of, this follow-up question specifically. You want to make sure that the value statement that you gave in your initial answer is not changing because of this kind of follow-up question. So that was, a sample MMI scenario. And yeah, that really concludes some of the advice that I had for the MMI. And if you are interested in having more individual practice sessions, I do have packages available currently. So if you only want to purchase 1 hour, that'll be $60 per hour. Whereas if you bought it in 4 hours, it'd be $220. So you get to save $20. And I do both Casper and interview prep sessions. But right now, since it's interview season and Casper is in like, September, October, I'll be mostly focusing on interview prep sessions. But yeah, thank you for showing up. And truly good luck in your interview process. I think it's already a huge accomplishment that you've made it this far. And just carry on that confidence and happiness in your interview, and your interviewers will see that. So I am finished now. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. You can just type it in the chat and I'll try to answer them. Okay, I'll stick around for like another 5 minutes, but if you have, questions that you think about, later on, you can always shoot me a message on acceptedtogether.com, or I can also send you my email in the chat. Yeah, thanks a lot, guys.